F-Zero, Nintendo's most neglected franchise. Well, aside from Kid Icarus maybe, but then again there's only like 4 Kid Icarus fans on the planet. It's no wonder that series went a whole 20 years without a game. F-Zero is the real Nintendo unsung hero. The most we've gotten from this series in nearly 20 years is the regular appearance of Captain Falcon in Smash, alongside various tracks from this franchise's amazing catalog of music. F-Zero's last game was in 2004 on the GBA. We've gotten a new Half-Life game of all things, but Nintendo just refuses to let this series rise from the ashes once more. And Lord only knows why. Then again, Nintendo's been on a bit of an alienating the gaming community spree as of lately. It's not like they care about this underrated series despite it still having a cult fanbase. Oh well, if Nintendo's not going to do the proper job of acknowledging this series, then a Table Scraps YouTuber reviewer will. F-Zero started off as a launch title for the Super Nintendo in 1991. The 80s was finally over. Nirvana had just ended the careers of several glam metal bands with their sophomore album, and arguably the first ever console war had just arose with the battle between the Genesis/Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo. F-Zero was more or less made as a tech demo to showcase the pseudo-3D capabilities of the system known as Mode 7. Something so earth-shatteringly impressive that everyone just played Super Mario World instead. Yeah, F-Zero was never the biggest franchise on the market, even in its heyday. That being said, the debut effort went on to sell nearly 3 million copies, and remains the 15th best-selling title on the SNES. It's just that this series would never come close to those tremendous sales ever again, sadly. The following effort, F-Zero X, wouldn't even sell half of that. Probably a result of lackluster marketing, but whatever. So with F-Zero being a rather groundbreaking title, how does it hold up now? Starting off, you were given 3 championships to compete in, and 4 vehicles to choose from. F-Zero is a futuristic racer with a very technical style of gameplay. It's not an easy game, and that's something you can say about pretty much every entry in the series, really. Cornering pretty much requires quick tapping of the B button, and many tracks are littered with obstacles and hindrances such as patches of dirt, bombs, fickle winds, and fucking magnets. Even on beginner difficulty, this game was quite the ass whooper. Your mileage may vary on whether or not that's a good thing, though. At times, stuff like this feels like a carryover from the NES era. You know, games that would pad out their length with trial and error gameplay. Your vehicle has a health bar as well. Take enough damage or fall off the track and you go kaboom. But thankfully you can replenish your vehicle health on these little strips around the starting line. While the gameplay on the more lenient tracks is pretty fun, the tracks that rely on tedious gimmicks such as random winds blowing your vehicle back and forth are just obnoxious, something an uninitiated individual would most likely confuse for a glitch at first. I'm not opposed to the difficulty obviously, but there are games later in the series that, while still difficult, manage to make it feel more natural as opposed to a barrier hastily slapped in front of you to pad out the game time. Just for reference, this game can easily be beaten in under an hour. Semi-fair for the time, I guess, but that's not helped by a career mode that gives you no incentive to play it. There are no unlockables in this game, so if you complete all the leagues on beginner mode, you've ostensibly 100%ed the game, which I have done when I first played this game. But I didn't even bother this time, not out of laziness, but because the act of getting 100% completion is redundant and meaningless. This game was touted as a visual milestone upon launch, thanks in no part to the Mode 7 pseudo 3D on display. And while impressive for the time and featuring some satisfying backgrounds, it does have a myriad of oddities, such as in the metro circuits where the areas outside of the track look like a giant circuit board. And because the SNES's 3D capabilities would be pushed to their limits in later games such as Star Fox, even on its own merits, this game is far from the best looking SNES game when compared to the rest of the library. But that's unimportant. F-Zero has a reputation within its cult fanbase for outstanding OSTs, and F-Zero 1 soundtrack is often considered one of the best on the SNES. It's okay in my opinion. The compositions themselves are fantastic for the most part, and would later be remixed in future titles, but there's one thing holding it back: the sound font. This soundtrack is trying to go for a hard rock and metal inspired sound, which I'm more than support of, obviously, but it's tarnished by the fact that the main instruments are fucking horn instruments, and very muffled and farty ones too. I guess you could say this OST is very horny. I'm not funny. The SNES was very much capable of producing heavy metal majesty, if the Mega Man X OST is to judge by, among others. But this game fails at living up to other MIDI metal soundtracks that would inspire my own discography. I will say though, it can sort of be excused by the fact it was a game from the launch days of the SNES. Devs had yet to fully learn the ins and outs of the sound chip yet, so it's at least understandable, but I'd still say that this probably has the weakest soundtrack of the entire series. Actually, no, I take that back. F-Zero GP Legend has the worst OST, mainly because the fact it has less bass than Injustice for All, but maybe I'll get to that on a later date. F-Zero is seen as one of the best SNES games of all time, and according to Wikipedia, one of the best games, period. But I was honestly left feeling very empty with this game. Maybe it's unfair to judge it considering it was a launch title, but Super Mario World was a launch title and that game's an absolute blast. F-Zero is just one of those games that couldn't help but age somewhat poorly, and in hindsight offers little replay value or incentive to play it in the first place. The soundtrack had some great compositions, but those have been vastly improved tenfold in future titles. So no, this game really isn't worth playing nowadays outside of curiosity. It only really gets points for laying the groundwork for this underrated racing series, and for that, I give it a 6 out of 10. I was initially going to give this game a 5.5, but after playing it again, it is slightly better than I initially thought. That being said, it's still not one of the best SNES games. I'm sure this game was the tits back in its heyday, but I'm personally more of an ass guy. But hold on to your butts, because we aren't done yet, as 10 years later, we would get F-Zero Maximum Velocity. Now, why exactly am I skipping F-Zero X in favor of this portable title, you ask? Well, because this game is basically F-Zero 1, but better in every single regard. So much so that I'd say it's one of the most underrated games ever. It's amazing how little this title gets talked about. After the retroactively disappointing F-Zero 1, I wondered if this childhood favorite of mine would also be disappointing in hindsight. But boy was I proven wrong. As soon as I booted up this game and heard that amazing title theme, I was giddy in excitement, something that would only increase as I played through this game. F-Zero 1 may have been a technical marvel for its time, but it is ruined by difficulty that's as fair and balanced as Fox News, and a lack of any unlockables that would inspire players to stick around this debut effort. Thankfully, Maximum Velocity is way more fun to play, and while still tough, it's very fair. So much so that I didn't fail a single race through my entire playthrough while on intermediate difficulty. I got my ass whooped quite a bit on easy mode in the last game, but this game's improved difficulty balancing was a breath of fresh air. Gone are the obnoxious roadblocks like windy levels and other bullshit. You still have your bombs and other things that will slow you down, but it's not that hard to avoid them, and it doesn't feel like a hindrance. Not to mention, this game has unlockables. Something actually inspires you to play through this game. I can't believe how much better this game is. This is all on top of a much improved presentation, while still keeping the same visual styling as the original. The sprite work is top-notch given the 32-bit hardware, and the sense of speed puts Sonic the Hedgehog to shame. All that, and having one of the best original soundtracks of all gaming. After the farty outdated mediocrity that was F-Zero 1's soundtrack, hearing some proper hard rock and guitars was a welcome change of pace, with tunes such as the infectious Bianca City, 10th Zone East. And Cloud Carpet. In short, Maximum Velocity has arguably the most underrated OST in all of gaming. It is a crime this soundtrack never gets talked about, because it is a work of absolute perfection. F-Zero Maximum Velocity is an overlooked gem, and my personal favorite of the F-Zero games I've played, but that's only because this and F-Zero 1 are the only ones I've played. Alright, update, I've actually played GP Legend, or at least parts of it. Not enough to where I can properly judge it, although I will say one thing. Like I said earlier in this review, I think its soundtrack is absolute ass. Hopefully I'll rectify that in the near future though. Maximum Velocity is a must-play for the GBA, alongside GP Legend, which I hear is even better somehow. Maybe I'll get to that as well in the future. But as for Maximum Velocity, I give it a 7.5 out of 10, and it's very close to getting an 8. Alright, yet another update. I'd actually give F-Zero Maximum Velocity an 8 now, having played GP Legend. This review's been kind of a mess lately, but that's what happens when you've just started becoming a big F-Zero fan. Coming back to this childhood favorite of mine has sparked my interest in the F-Zero series, and I plan on trying out other titles such as F-Zero X and GX, both of which are considered the absolute apex of the franchise. F-Zero is a series that died an undignified death, and while it sucks 10 tons of ass that this series went into permanent hiatus, it is understandable from a business standpoint. F-Zero is far from Nintendo's most profitable series, with the debut effort being the only one to sell more than 2 million copies, and the rest hovering around the 1 million mark or less. 1 million copies may be a smash for an indie dev, but for a behemoth like Nintendo, that's mere chump change. And like most other AAA game companies, money is the bottom line with Nintendo. Just because they make fun, colorful games for the whole family doesn't make them any less evil than companies who pump out the same tired brown and gray shooters and sports games every year. With the way Nintendo is right now, I'll doubt they'll ever bring F-Zero out of the grave. That sucks, but in the meantime, the F-Zero series is more than worth getting into if you've never played it. So do whatever you have to do, buy it or God forbid emulate it, because this series is more than worth your time. One real reason I'd love for F-Zero to make a comeback is the music. F-Zero games in general have had fantastic music. Even F-Zero 1 with its doot-doot horn sections had fantastic compositions that would later be improved upon in future sequels. And while GX semi-controversially went for an electronic soundtrack, it's a damn good electronic soundtrack. I may be a big metal fan, but I love me some good old-fashioned techno, trance, drum and bass, or whatever the fuck you call it. And GX still had some rock amidst all the futuristic electronica. In short, there is no bad F-Zero OST, and it has one of my favorite track records in all of video game OSTs. And what gaming really needs right now is some speed metal majesty. Sure, Doom Eternal's OST was pretty good, but that industrial gent sound is starting to sound dated. I want to hear some Painkiller-styled riffs, and maybe even add vocals in there. That kind of stuff will never be dated. One thing that I learned about F-Zero GX, the absolute apex of F-Zero, is that some of the soundtrack was composed by Daiki Kasho, the same person who has composed music for the Gran Turismo series from 3 onwards. That just makes me love him even more. It's fitting that 2 of my favorite racing game series have had the same composer producing parts of the original scores. I just hope they add the Blue Falcon into Gran Turismo 7. You know, whenever the hell it actually releases. Oh well, you can never rush perfection.